right as an animal owner has been taken away. And that's why this is important. And that's why you should be members of organizations like AFA and others in order to protect your rights as an animal owner. And you'll hear me talk a lot about animal ownership. And yes, you do own your animals. And yes, those animals do have value. And that's an important concept. Because if you take away the value of those animals, you can take away those animals. And all of these regulations and all of these laws take away a little bit more of that value. And that's why it's important to you as a pet owner. And why it is important that you are involved. Or if you operate a sanctuary, or you adopt birds out, or you're Charlie and you sell birds. You know, that's why it is important that we all work together on these type of things. So, that's the bad news. Any questions?
If a Blue Throated Macaw was purchased before they passed legislation that you couldn't own one, could they still take it away?
Yes.
Do you know if that's New York State as well?
I don't specifically know about New York State, and I'll give you this example. We're about to get into this, and I'll show you just how many laws are on the books. And of course, this is actually a regulation put forward by Fish and Wildlife, and regulations and laws are different. We'll get into that a little bit. But I always like to tell people this. It's kind of like when I run into people and they go, "I know someone else from Texas." Well, that's great. There's a lot of Texans.
Do you know?
But you know, there's also a lot of laws on books, and I by far, even as a lobbyist, can't keep up with all of them. We try. But that's why we need you, as pet owners and animal people and everything else, to work with the overall organizations and stuff to report back what's going on in New York and how can we help and how do we get out there, and then it's our job to help you to know how to communicate with, you know, your legislatures and those type of things.
Do you work with the Animal Legal Defense Fund?
I personally do not.
They might be able to help. There are people lawyers that work for animal defense.
Brent, as far as the Endangered Species Act goes, do they ever take an animal off of that?
I'm glad you asked that. That is an excellent question.
Yeah, I won't tell him when you gave me
as
$20.
another reason to join AFA, of course, I'm going to hawk AFA and I'm going to hawk Charlie that you should go to his store because Charlie sponsored me to be here today. So she paid for my training to come up here. So go to Charlie's store and support him because I drank a lot on the train and he has to pay for it. So wildlife to delist the golden conure. Because we have the data that says the golden conures are no longer endangered in the wild and they shouldn't be regulated by the federal regulation and everything else. And we're going to do the same thing that the other communities do and ask that those species be delisted. And we have a whole group of other animals that should be delisted as well. Now, to back up a little bit, the Endangered Species Act was never intended to regulate your animals. What happened was we passed the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act wasn't intended to regulate captive wildlife because, and in fact, I don't even use the term captive wildlife anymore. These are domestic animals by this point. I mean, these birds that y'all have out here are 6 and 7 generations away from wild birds. In my aviary, have a couple of birds that are left, just that I keep around. I mean, they're past breeding age and everything else. I keep them and I'll keep them till the end of their lives. But those birds are, you know, there's few and far between now. But the Endangered Species Act was meant to save animals in the wild. And regulating your pet bird doesn't do anything for those animals in the wild. That was an interpretation made by lawyers at the agency. And of course, agencies always want to build their agencies bigger. So why not interpret that they're regulating all of this other stuff? Fast forward to 2014, the agency really doesn't want to do it anymore. They found themselves in a quandary because they're caught between the environmental animal rights community and pet owners and animal owners, and they don't really know how to regulate all these things and be able to do it. I mean, if we just talk birds, it's bad enough. If you get into reptiles, small mammals, I mean, chinchillas are considered endangered species. I mean, it gets pretty ridiculous pretty fast.
Is there any activity to repeal this law?
Yes, so there is a big movement in Congress, and of course we all know just how fast Congress is moving these days. But there is a movement in Congress to look at the Endangered Species Act and look at what kind of reforms need to be made to make it a more workable act. And I'll be the first to tell you, I think the Endangered Species Act does some really great things. It just doesn't do everything it was intended to do. And it's been manipulated to that point.
What about, I know specifically with the Quakers, they're deemed invasive species in certain states. Are there any other birds that have been threatened as far as captive owned because they're considered a threat to the...
And so invasive species is another way. If you went by the AFA booth, the Java rice finch is also one that has been deemed as an invasive species, and AFA and other groups are working to really, you know, how do you work with federal government to make sure that, you know, people can keep those birds in legitimate ways. And let's be realistic. There are some of the birds that we keep that, and Quakers are a good example, that can survive out there in the wild. Are they really that dangerous? I mean, they're not passenger pigeons. They're not wiping out crops in huge numbers. They're not doing all these other things. They're a pain in the ass to the power company, but, you know, what do you need to do? So legislation 101, and we'll get to this. So this is what I talked about. This is this year. There are 9,420 bills and resolutions that have been introduced in Congress. Less than 5% of those will become law. If you really think about that, most of the things that become law are appropriations bills that have to go on to fund the government, those type of things. We name a lot of post offices. We rename a lot of post offices. It's all stuff to fill time. And, you know, I was chief of staff of the House Agriculture Committee that had jurisdiction over the Animal Welfare Act for over a decade. You know, we just do a lot of things these days that are just filling time. By the end of this session, all of those bills go away and they introduce all new bills. So it kind of gives you an overwhelming idea of just how much legislation is out there. So this is one of the things I always like to do. You know, it's not an impossible world out there. Legislation, and we should play Schoolhouse Rock. It's probably the best example of how a bill actually becomes a law that's out there. But there's lots of things that you can do in legislation to prevent legislation from moving forward, those type of things. Committees are supposed to have hearings. You can testify at those hearings. They're supposed to have markups in subcommittees. You can amend the bill in subcommittee. If you can't get it amended in subcommittee, you can get amended in full committee. When it goes to the floor of the House, the Rules Committee sets forth a rule. You can actually have it amended in the rule. Then it has to go to the Senate. The Senate has to do the same things. You can amend the bill in the Senate. You can do all of those type of things. It has to go to conference. You can actually, we've actually taken bills that were whole other different laws and replaced them with another thing in conference and then passed it on the floor. Congress, in the rules of how they work, gets pretty wacky. So you can kill it in the Senate and everything else. And then it goes to the agencies. And the agencies do what they call the rulemaking process. So they actually determine how they're going to implement the law. So the best example that we just talked about in the Endangered Species Act, it was actually the agency who determined that they were going to regulate all your birds by the rule that they set forth back in the 1970s. This is interesting. Y'all all saw in the news how Boehner and his cronies and everything else. I have to be careful. So there's Boehner was one of the members on the House Agriculture Committee for years and years, and I actually like John and think that he does a good job. But they sued the executive branch, right, over health care. This is and everybody goes, this is stupid. You know, this is just typical politics. But I ask you to watch this process, and the reason I ask you to watch this process is the game is starting to change. You now have the legislative branch using the judicial branch to sue the executive branch. That's not really the way the forefathers envisioned all of this to work. But if it starts working, you're going to see a lot more of that. And whether or not that's good for government or bad, it's a whole other debate. But it is changing the process. So some key terms to know. We have authorizing committees. Those are committees like the House Agriculture Committee that pass laws and those type of things. Appropriations committees, those are the committees that actually fund those laws, give the money to it. So if I don't like a law and it's authorized in the committee, a lot of times what I'll do as a lobbyist is I'll go to the appropriators and I'll ask the appropriators to not fund any money for it. Because if there's no money to operate it, they can't do it. So we do that quite a bit. And then you have actual laws, and laws are different than regulations. So we just talked about Fish and Wildlife did a regulation to regulate your birds. That's not actual law, it's a regulation, it's still implemented. But that's how that is. And then agencies have policies, and policies dictate, how they operate from day to day. Other issues around the country that affect bird people. In Florida years ago went and actually got the legislature to pass rules that said that basically if you raise birds, it's considered an agricultural deal and you get a tax exemption for doing that the same way as you would raise cattle. Well, there are some tax assessors now that are suing certain agriculturists in Florida to say, well, you don't really count anymore. So that is going on. These pet store bans. Some interesting statistics on pet stores. Pet stores, okay, first of all, livestock sales, and when I say livestock sales, that means birds, gerbils, dogs, cats, whatever. Pet sales, livestock sales represent 4% of all pet store sales in the country, okay? 4%.
That's in volume or in dollars?
In dollars. But it's a $60 billion industry. It's a $60 billion industry that's essentially run like a mom and pop shop. It really is to this day. They're not organized in the way that they should be and all of those type of things. But we've seen the activist community and others go in and say that they're going to do these pet store bans, which basically says that you can't sell livestock in a pet store. Well, let me tell you why they do this. A pet store that has livestock in the store, like Charlie's store that has birds or whatever else, and if you were watching Charlie today, everybody's over there to see the birds, right? A pet store that has livestock in the store, whatever it is, has 60% more traffic than a store that doesn't. You know why Petco and PetSmart and all of those guys still have fish and birds and everything else? They're a pain in the ass for them to keep because animals are hard to keep. But it's to drive sales. Because all of you will go to a pet store that has birds or animals in it because you want to go see them, even if you don't buy them. And that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you can take that away, then suddenly sales drop off because you'll go to Walmart to buy your food just as fast as you'll go anywhere else. And what I always say is what you should really do is go support a local pet store owner like Charlie or somebody else and buy there. I mean, if you're going to buy local from the farmer's market and everything else, why aren't you going to go buy local from him? Because he's actually going to have a connection to those animals that he's selling and those type of things, more than a big chain store would have. And in full disclosure, I actually work for Petco.